We're seeing a notable change in the crowd of protesters in downtown Portland after the first night Oregon State troopers stepped in for federal officers. The change took place last night as part of a deal that Governor Kate Brown made with the federal government to withdraw Customs and Border Protection along with ICE officers in an attempt to de-escalate nightly protests. All new at 6, we're joined by Fox 12's Drew Marine, who is among the huge crowd and takes us through how all this played out. And Drew, we understand that this was one of the most peaceful nights you've seen out there covering protests.
Yeah, that's right. I've covered a few nights where federal officers were involved, but last night I didn't see any officers come out to interact with protesters. And in the nights I've been downtown, last night was by far the most peaceful I've seen the crowd. There were a few incidents where protesters set off a firework or two near the courthouse or started a small fire behind the fence, but that fire I saw was almost immediately put out by other protesters. It felt like demonstrators were genuinely making an effort to keep the peace.
About 1,000 people showed up Thursday night for another night of protests downtown. With Oregon State Police slated to step in for federal officers at the courthouse, we were unsure what to expect from the crowd and, for that matter, Oregon State Police. OSP says their role was to bring down the protest's temperature, so it really was just a waiting game to see how the night would play out. Before the night began, protesters told us they were unsure if OSP's presence was going to actually help de-escalate protests.
Same people, different suit.
But around 9 o'clock, the night started off with several hundred people drawn to the powerful speakers in front of the Justice Center who were leading chants and sharing stories.
Right? It's easier to come together and be this one big fist. But there are more of us that need to come down in peaceful protest, but they're like that.
The crowd listened intently to the speakers and eventually drifted over to the courthouse around 10:15, where individual speakers had megaphones leading chants and having conversations with the crowd.
We are making history!
At one point, a man used his skateboard to bang on the fence, but was immediately lectured by other demonstrators to stop. That was just one of many instances last night where we saw protesters step in to de-escalate things and urged people to be peaceful. We also saw a small fire set behind the fence, but before we could pull our camera up to film it, the fire was already put out by protesters. By 11 o'clock in previous nights, we'd normally see protesters getting more amped up, pointing lasers at officers, throwing trash over the fence, and setting off more fireworks directed at the courthouse. In response to that, we would also typically hear federal officers warn protesters and eventually see them come out from the courthouse to disperse tear gas. But last night was different. From 11 o'clock until we left at 1 a.m., protesters kept up the momentum by chanting, having conversations, and remaining peaceful, something protesters earlier in the day were hoping for.
The real Black Lives Matter movement is not about going in and destroying property. The real Black Lives Matter movement is about just equality for Black people first and foremost, and then overall just everyone.
In those last 2 hours we were there, we heard what seemed to be glass bottles being thrown over the fence onto the empty sidewalk. But after that, we didn't see or hear anything else get thrown over the fence. We left at 1 in the morning and had seen no officers come out of the building to interact with protesters, and no tear gas had been used for what seems to be the first night in at least a week. Portland police tells us over the next hour or two, everyone left without any police interaction.
We saw several people last night prepared with gas masks, homemade shields, and umbrellas, all tools they've used previously in preparation to bang on the fence and protect themselves from pepper balls and tear gas. Some protesters we spoke with say they were relieved to get a break from the chaos we normally see and focus on why the protest started in the first place, to stand with the Black Lives Matter movement. Live in studio, Drew Marine, Fox 12 Oregon.